Why are Republican lawmakers in Columbus so intent on making it difficult for Ohioans to pass amendments to the Constitution when the current system has been in place for more than 100 years? Because it's part of a larger campaign by the Ohio Republican Party to prevent women from having control over their own bodies. It's also designed to undermine any effort by Ohioans to ensure fair and non-gerrymandered legislative districts. With huge majorities in the Ohio House and Senate and the governor's office, Republicans have no qualms about riding roughshod over the rights of the people. I'm Bertram de Souza, host of the Scribbler Publishing Group video podcast, streamed on my YouTube channel and Facebook page, and WFMJ.com and other digital platforms. My guests today are actively involved in the statewide effort to stop Republicans in Columbus from enacting their extremist policies. Jen Miller is Executive Director of the League of Women Voters of Ohio. Mike Curtin is a former state representative and former editor and associate publisher of the Columbus Dispatch. Jen and Mike are part of the statewide coalition battling the proposal to make it more difficult to pass constitutional amendments. Thank you, Jen and Mike, for joining me today to discuss what I believe is one of the most important issues confronting the state of Ohio today, namely the push by Republicans in the General Assembly to dilute the power of voters in the state. But before we delve into this issue, House Joint Resolution 6 originally, I would like each of you to tell us about yourselves, especially your involvement in important public policy matters. And Jen, if you would go first, that would be great.
Sure. It's my honor to be here. I'm the director of the League of Women Voters of Ohio. We were the Ohio Women's Suffrage Association, and we became the league in 1920. Our goal is to really serve every voter of the state of Ohio to make sure that they have the information they need to participate as voters and that their votes and voices are meaningful. We demystify government. We help Ohioans understand government so that they are more informed voters, but also so that they can be advocates and raise their voices on all the issues that matter to them. We have used ballot initiatives for a long time, especially trying to secure redistricting reforms in the state. And so that's where we find this particularly important, is that Ohioans need to have the ability to collect signatures and place issues on the ballot about critical public policy decisions, whether it's redistricting or healthcare or workers' rights, that this is a tradition that we've had for a long time and it's worth defending.
Mike, whom I've known for a long time, veteran journalist like Mike I was, tell us a little about yourselves and then we'll go into questions.
Thank you, Bertram. It's good to be with you and Jen. Like you, I was a career newspaper man. I spent 38 years at the Columbus Dispatch from 1973 through 2011 in a variety of roles, but most of my career was dedicated to the coverage of local and state government, local and state public policy. And in the pursuit of my studies and reporting over all those years, I devoted quite a bit of time to trying to understand our state constitution, its evolution, the fights for the various amendments over the decades, and developed quite an appreciation for the marvelous document that it is. After I retired from the Dispatch at the end of 2011, I was looking for some nonprofit work to do, and lo and behold, as you know, every 10 years they draw new legislative districts, and new ones were drawn in 2011 following the 2010 census, and a new one was drawn where I lived with no incumbent, and apparently nobody lined up, to run that I knew of. So I thought, well, this could be my grad school, and I ran and got elected and served 2 terms in the Ohio House, representing the west and south sides of Columbus. And while I was there, I had the privilege of serving on the Ohio Constitutional Modernization Commission. And the Constitutional Modernization Commission met for about 4 years, overlapping my time in the House to do a deep dive into the Constitution and to study it and recommend proposed changes for the legislature and the people of Ohio. So I furthered my study of the Constitution then. And what draws me to this fight is I was appalled when I learned just 1 week after the November election that the person just reelected to Secretary of State, Frank LaRose, who I knew from his days in the legislature, was proposing something he never talked about during the campaign. He just spent an entire year running for a reelection to become to remain the state's chief elections officer, the Secretary of State. And 1 week after the election, he holds a press conference to unveil this mammoth redistribution of power, to propose a 60% threshold for passing future state constitutional amendments by citizen initiative. And this is a right that Ohioans have had for 111 years, a product of that great 1912 state constitutional convention, the pinnacle of our political history. And the reason we have the initiative and the referendum was because the great reformers trying to reform our state house from having the most corrupt state house in the country to having a respectable, followed the advice of Teddy Roosevelt and followed the advice of other great reformers and gave their people the opportunity to vote for the constitutional initiative, the statutory initiative, and the referendum. And Ohioans did that by what? By a landslide vote of 57.5% of the vote. 60%, Bertram, is an attempt to shoot the initiative process in Ohio and leave it by the side of the road.
Yeah, so Jen, as the executive director of the League of Women Voters of Ohio, you have characterized the advocates of raising this threshold from now a simple majority, from a majority of 50 plus 1 to 60% plus 1, as, and I quote this, a group of extremist politicians who are seeking to end majority rule for ballot initiatives and undermine the sacred principle of one person, one vote in Ohio. Could you expound on that, and could you sort of delve into some as what you mean by that?
Right. So making ballot initiatives harder, or making it harder for citizens to go collect those signatures and get an issue on the ballot, making it harder to do that takes away power from voters and actually gives more power to the General Assembly. You know, the great thing about ballot initiatives is that it's a little bit of an equalizer. If the Ohio General Assembly is not acting out of the interests of the people of Ohio, if they are not meeting the needs of the people of Ohio, voters have recourse. We can ourselves get issues on the ballot and have voters decide. We all need to protect this freedom because it's about determining our future. It's about how we can use the ballot box to expand and defend the freedoms of every Ohioan.
And Mike, you've covered state politics for decades, and I was intrigued when Jen used the words extremist politicians, because if you look at Ohio today, it almost seems as though extremism, especially among Republicans, is a good calling card if you want to run for office, etc. So what is driving this? What is going on here that all of a sudden, as you pointed out, the Secretary of State, you know, after he wins re-election, decides this is an issue he wants to pursue? What's going on here?
Two things, Bertram. First of all, to your point about extremism, when one party controls everything, and we know Ohio is becoming redder and redder for quite some time now, and when one party has a hegemony of power, like the Republicans have now, controlling all executive offices, controlling both houses of the General Assembly by 2/3 ratio or better, and having the judiciary all locked up, the only action is within your own party. And so right now, the only thing that most state legislators fear is not a general election, you know, from a Democrat, because they have their safe gerrymandered districts, super gerrymandered districts. What they fear is a primary campaign and being outflanked on their right. Because as you know, primaries are usually controlled by the most passionate
Yes.
members, or extreme, if you want to use that word, of a party. And so the Republican Party has been moving ever forward rightward, ever more extreme to the right for several election cycles now, because these guys and ladies fear not being conservative enough, and therefore being vulnerable to a challenge from the right. That's what drives this policy. And what else drives it are these Republican right-wing think tanks, like from the Koch brothers. This effort to create supermajority requirements in the states that have the tools of direct democracy has been an agenda item by the Heritage Foundation and the American Legislative Exchange Council and other right-wing think tanks for quite some time. They don't want the citizens having the power, as Jen said, to check the guys in the legislature. So that's the primary thing driving this is just that.
And Jen, as Mike pointed out, this is not just Ohio where this kind of push is being made. So what is the National League of Women Voters position on this, and how are they responding to this nationally?
I cannot speak about what the National League is doing without kind of talking to them first, but I do know that leagues across the country are jumping up to defend direct democracy, or that ability for citizens to place issues on the ballot. Ultimately, part of the reason why I say this is an extremist policy is because it's so unfair and it's so undemocratic. Let's keep in mind that we're talking about a freedom, a right that Ohio citizens have had for over 100 years. Right. But we also know it's unpopular, and that we see it failing. When voters go to the ballot box and decide if ballot initiatives should be harder, right, they're voting that down, including in very conservative states. And finally, I would argue that it's unnecessary, and I'm hoping that my dear friend Mike will talk about right. how hard it already is. It's really hard to get the signatures you need. It's hard to get through the ballot board with language that makes sense. Right. It's hard to do the education campaigns to get voters to vote a certain way. And so that is why you will see not just League here kind of like really raising our voices against making ballot initiatives harder, but that's why that's happening across the state by leagues.
Yeah, Mike, to the point that Jen made about, you're looking at this, you have provided an analysis of 18 bond issues for debt to build Ohio dating back to 1980. You've noted that 12 of the 18 passed under the current majority rule of 50+1. If the 60+1 threshold had been in place, 4 of the 12 would have been rejected by the voters. And you say, in addition, 2 critical building programs barely passed with margins just over 60%. Given today's political environment, in which government at all levels are viewed with deep distrust and skepticism, what does your analysis say about the future if this, 60+1 or 60% threshold does become, is enacted?
A 60% voting threshold would be debilitating to a lot of public debt issue programs proposed by state government. Our state has a history of skepticism toward debt. We still have in our state constitution an 1851 debt limit of $750,000. Right. Because of the scandals during the canal building period and railroad building period and the state investments in private companies that went bust. And so that $750,000 debt limit is still there from our 1851 Constitution. There are several efforts by Governor Rhodes to remove it, but the voters said, no, we're not going to remove it. As a consequence, when the state wants to float debt to build schools, colleges, roads, water systems, wastewater systems, all these things that are part of our quality of life, they have to go periodically to the ballot and ask the voters to approve the debt. Well, as that analysis shows, 60% is tough to get to, no matter how meritorious the program. And oftentimes, it has to lose before it finally wins. The DeRolf school building
Right.
program that the state was under order to do to give our kids adequate schools took 2 attempts at the ballot before it finally passed. Bob Taft's Third Frontier program to bring high tech, state support to high tech failed. And then when it did finally pass, it was by less than 60%. We wouldn't have the high tech programs in Ohio we have today if a 60% voting threshold were in place. So those are the types of critical programs that are at risk if this thing were to be enacted.
And noteworthy that Bob Taft was a Republican governor. So it's not as though, it's only Democrats who have gone to the ballot for these constitutional amendments. Republican administrations, Republicans have also done so. And so, Jen, as you said, over a century, everyday Ohioans have had the freedom to collect signatures and pass ballot initiatives to make people's lives better. This resolution is unnecessary, unpopular, undemocratic on our broad coalition, and our broad coalition stands ready to defeat it. How do you intend to do that? What kind of campaign are you waging? And then I'll go to Mike to see, to what extent he's getting involved in this.
So first, I would point to our track record. We've defeated this twice. The lawmakers attempted to make ballot initiatives harder in the fall of 2018, and we were successful in defending that. They attempted to fast track this last year, and we defended that. We do know it's coming back, but let's just keep in mind that we know that the people of Ohio want the freedom to change our Constitution and change our laws through the ballot initiative process. We have hundreds of organizations from Lake Erie to the Ohio River standing with us in opposition to this. Keep in mind that if the lawmakers did pass an initiative to make ballot initiatives harder, that would then get put on the ballot.
Right.
And all of our organizations are going to be joining together to educate voters on why this is a power grab, to educate voters on why this is incredibly un-Ohio, as well as being undemocratic and unfair. And we would have a robust, diverse vote no campaign that I think if we need to, we will defeat this at the ballot box. My hope is instead that we can convince lawmakers to not abandon the people of Ohio and abandon this sacred right that we've had for over a century.
And Mike, while I hear what Jen's saying, and I have no doubt that there will the League of Women Voters and other organizations will wage an aggressive campaign against. There is a political reality in Ohio today where it seems that the makeup of the General Assembly, in my 40 years of covering Ohio politics, has never been so strident, I don't believe, among Republicans as I see now. And so is there a way to be reasonable with these legislators? And if they do have, and if if the Secretary of State does have his way, and they do pass the resolution and it's put on the ballot, does it worry you that Ohio's, being so red today would be a major hurdle to overcome?
Well, it would be. Leaders in business, leaders in academia, leaders across the board are concerned about this more and more extreme General Assembly, and not only what they're trying to do, but what they're trying to stop. The reason that there was a rush in lame duck session to try to rush this to a May ballot in an odd-numbered year, which would be precedent setting.
Right.
We haven't had a legislature ever propose such a momentous amendment to the Constitution for a spring ballot in an odd-numbered year, because Bertram, as you know, voter turnout is so low in those elections that we want a high voter turnout. We want as much participation as possible in these momentous elections. Well, the reason the attempt has been on and remains on, trying to rush us to the ballot as soon as possible, is because the ever more right-wing General Assembly is trying to stop a few things. Most notably, they know well that there's a movement in the state to qualify a reproductive rights amendment
Right.
for the statewide ballot. And they know that all the polls in Ohio for quite some time have shown that if a wisely structured, wisely worded amendment such as that were put on the ballot, it most likely would pass by 56, 57, 58, somewhere in the high 50s. That's
Right.
where the polling numbers have been. At 50% plus one, a carefully crafted reproductive rights amendment passes in Ohio. They know that. And so the rush to get a 60% threshold to the ballot is being driven primarily by that. Secondarily, they know that Jen and other good government groups, the League of Women Voters and the coalition that's worked so long and so hard to try to erect anti-gerrymandering boundaries, barriers in our state, have to go back at it because the majority party ignored the will of the people in this last go around in drawing districts and ignored the express language of the amendments that we adopted in 2015 and 2018 for state legislative and for congressional districts. So you have the reproductive rights amendment in the works. You have another anti-gerrymandering amendment in the works. And thirdly, there's organizing around an amendment to raise the state minimum wage to $15 an hour for the state minimum wage. Well, the majority party's opposed to all three of those, and especially number one, the reproductive rights amendment.
Right.
And that's why they're trying to erect this high barrier as soon as they possibly can.
And so, Jen, I don't know whether the League of Women Voters of Ohio can get embroiled into this whole reproductive rights debate or issue. But I do know that the redistricting issue is one that is really, as far as organizations such as yours, are of great concern. Indeed, the now retired Chief Justice of the Ohio Supreme Court has said that, based on her reading of the current, constitutional amendments that were passed on redistricting, because of the vagueness and because of all of these things, she's going to get involved in trying to clean up some of that language to make it clear as to how, Ohio can avoid this gerrymandering that has occurred. So then again, as Mike has pointed out, these politicians, these members of the General Assembly, don't want that language cleaned up. They don't want clarity because look at the advantage they now hold as far as the districts go. So to speak to that whole issue of gerrymandering, if you will.
So first off, I'd like to point out that the League has been working to fight gerrymandering or to try to get fair districts for the people of Ohio since as early as the 40s. Yeah. We really ramped up our campaign in the 1970s, first fighting the Democratic Party that was trying to rig legislative districts for their favor, and more recently the Republican Party. We've tried many different times at the ballot box. I think this last round of mapping was particularly heartbreaking because we finally decided to negotiate. The good government groups negotiated with the General Assembly, with the Republican Party, with the Democratic Party. We did not think that the reforms that voters eventually passed in 2015 and 2018 were perfect, but we were hoping that since it was such a grand work of compromise and how they were crafted, that better angels would prevail in making those maps. As we saw, and it's hard for folks to really follow this, but the Ohio Supreme Court struck down the Ohio State House maps 5 times and the Ohio congressional map twice, and those continue to go. What Maureen O'Connor said in one of her first filings as Chief Justice was that we might need to look at an independent commission. Here's the reality, and I think Ohioans instinctively understand this. When the entire redistricting commission is made up of elected officials, all 7, it's very hard for those elected officials to put aside their own personal interests or the interests of their friends. And so it's just too tempting to rig maps in their favor. So we would like to see an independent commission without politicians playing a role. We'd also like to see it more balanced. One of the things that the League, when we were negotiating with the General Assembly on these reforms, we kept walking away from the negotiating table because we were concerned about politicians being in charge, but we were also concerned about what would probably always be an imbalanced commission, where this time we had 5 Republicans and 2 Democrats, even though, Ohio is still just slightly more Republican in terms of how it casts votes. And so we would like to go back to the ballot box at some point for an independent and balanced commission. So it be everyday people, maybe faith leaders, professors, and lawyers from different parts of the state, good government groups, folks who don't really have a dog in the partisan fight, but also more balanced, that we would have about equal numbers of Republicans, Democrats, and independents. And I think those independents are particularly important because Ohioans are more likely to claim that they are independent than to be a member of either political party. Ohioans are also very likely to split their ticket. So this idea that Ohio is a red state is a little bit of a farce, I think, because, even in this past election, still, Republican candidates for the General Assembly, overall got about 50%, a little over 50%, but they have these robust supermajorities. That's from rigging maps. Right. And so we need to take the keys. We need to take the drawing pen away from the General Assembly in terms of making these districts, because they're always going to put their interests first.
And Mike, as Jen pointed out, the current districts were found to be unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. However, only one Republican on the court, the Chief Justice, joined with Democrats, right?
Yes.
And so the other Republicans did not, even though it was clear that the will of the people who voted for a new way of creating fair districts was totally ignored by Republicans in the General Assembly. What does that tell you when elected officials totally ignore the will of the people?
Well, it tells me that underscores Jen's central point, and that is we're not going to solve this absent a truly independent redistricting commission. We've seen this fight play out in state after state after state. We negotiated in good faith with both parties to get the 2015 and 2018 amendments, but the fatal flaw in those is that there was no final backstop that was truly independent. There was no language in those amendments that allowed the court, for example, having found a plan unconstitutional, to take control, to appoint a special master, to make sure that the right thing was done. It was left unaddressed as to how a stalemate, how an impasse would be addressed if a legislature refused to follow a legitimate court order. That's what happened. The General Assembly leadership looked at the language, got legal advice from their top lawyers, asked the question, what if we just stall and stalemate? And the answer came back, well, you can win that fight. And so that's what happened. We ended up having Republican federal judges say that the state legislative leadership could submit and get adopted one of their maps that had been rejected by the Supreme Court. It's a very unfortunate part now of our judicial history in this state. So we have to go back to the drawing board and come forth with a plan that delivers to Ohioans a truly independent redistricting commission. We've seen those work most recently now in Michigan. They've had a good experience with theirs up there. We need to look at best practices from redistricting plans around the country and give Ohioans an opportunity to adopt those best practices. And first and foremost will be the independence, the true independence of the commission that gives final approval to the maps.
And Jen, in discussing this, this next step and the creation of a true independent commission, I recall when we were still publishing at the Vindicator, there was a professor, I think, out of Michigan, who had created a program, a computer program, that really was tested and shown to be really effective and we advocated, the legislature bringing that, he had formed a group, bringing that group in to actually run, and we were just dismissed offhand as a newspaper editorially by the leadership and by Republicans in the General Assembly who said, oh, don't worry, we know what's best for Ohio. And so, and the people of Ohio voted to say, okay, we want fair districts, and once again, the legislature totally ignored that. What makes you believe that you can sort of convince or persuade members of the General Assembly in the majority that to be reasonable on an issue such as this?
Well, do you mean redistricting?
Yeah.
I actually think the point is that we have not been successful in getting the Ohio General Assembly or the Redistricting Commission in respecting the Ohio Constitution. We've not been successful in encouraging them to respect the Ohio Supreme Court, or even the voices of voters who voted for these reforms. And these reforms passed in all 88 counties by Republicans, Democrats, and Independents. The point actually is that we know for a fact that there are better ways to make maps that will keep communities together and result in maps that really respond to voters rather than being rigged for political parties and political outcomes. And so that's why we're going to have to go to the ballot box ourselves. It takes time to do the research. It takes time to collect the signatures, but we are very serious about doing that. This is the exact reason why making ballot initiatives harder should not be done, because it's check on power. The Ohio General Assembly had an assignment that they failed to complete. They had an assignment to follow the Ohio Constitution, to create maps that really respected the rights and needs of every voter and every community in its state. They didn't do it. And so now we have the freedom and the power to get out our clipboards, collect those signatures, talk to voters across the state, and get a new initiative on the ballot that would change the Constitution and require that maps are made by an independent and balanced body, rather than politicians who are going to put their folks first, and especially their big donors, and not everyday Ohioans.
Has this independent commission taken form in any way? What would it comprise?
So there's lots of different ways. Lots of states do this, and we are seeing that in general, when a state has an independent commission, you have districts that are not as sprawling. The shapes are not as weird.
Yeah.
The way so if 54% of Ohioans generally vote Republican for Congress or for the Ohio State House, it would be about that number of seats that would respond that way. You see more districts swinging back and forth between Republican and Democrat representatives holding those seats. But there are many different ways you can do it, and that's the research now. So we're looking at Arizona and Colorado and Michigan, but all over the country, what we see is that when politicians can no longer be the ones making the maps, we have maps that really respond to voters. We have districts that really work for us. And so we will be looking at this commission to be individuals who are not holding political office at this point in time. We will be looking for a commission that has about equal numbers of Republican, Democrat, and Independent. And we will also be looking to ensure that the governor and the General Assembly could not just override what this commission creates in terms of state house maps or the congressional districts.
Mike, I think you'll recall that there was a time when, looking at judicial offices, there was a push because the requirement to be a judge in Ohio is so low. You really don't. I mean, and we've seen some recent things There was the merit selection of judges was an issue that was much discussed, where they would be in a commission and you would go through and all of that and appoint judges, at least for the appeals court and the Supreme Court. However, that was shot down. And so I'm wondering, when you talk, like when Jen talks about an independent commission, how do you sell that kind of an idea to the people of Ohio on redistricting?
Well, I think you do it neighborhood by neighborhood. I think you show people what the maps look like. People can look at a map and intuitively understand if it looks fair or unfair. If it, when you see maps that look like Rorschach tests and that split neighborhoods and that, create squiggly lines, it doesn't take, as the old saying goes, a picture's worth 1,000 words. And showing people the maps makes the point for you. And then you explain why those maps look so distorted. They're distorted to minimize the power of the vote of one party and maximize the other. And that's what you have to do, cracking and packing, as they say, and to minimize the effectiveness of the votes of the opposition. So most people, average people out there making a living, understand basic fairness. They want fairness in their job. They want fairness in their schools and institutions. And you just explain that this is inherently unfair. It disrespects you as a voter. It treats you as a pawn as opposed to the person in charge. You explain that, and it's accepted. It's understood right away. It's not a hard sell, which is, to Jen's point, why this won in 88 counties across the state. The league and its allies have done a marvelous job in educating the people. So when we go back, say, look, you told the politicians you wanted fair maps. They disregarded what you told them. Now we have to do it in an even more stringent way so that they cannot put their finger on the scale any longer. We have to have true independence in the commission. And I think that sale will be easy to make. I think the people will embrace it, and I think we'll get it passed.
And Jen, on going back to House Joint Resolution 6, they to raise the sort of threshold for past constitutional amendments to 60%. So if the General Assembly, despite all of the opposition, decides, to pass the resolution and put it on the ballot, okay? Obviously, your group, your organization, and others will mount, I believe, an aggressive campaign against it. But these kinds of issues, I hate to say this, seem esoteric when you come to the voter of Ohio. Am I wrong in that? Go ahead.
I think you're wrong, actually. I think Ohioans in general understand that politicians get, kind of power hungry, and that they, the general Ohioan kind of understands that we have a lot of corruption coming out of the Ohio State House. The general Ohioan is not necessarily trusting of the Ohio General Assembly, versus our campaign is not just led by the League, which we have members in every congressional district and every Ohio Senate district, but it's also led by teachers in their community, firefighters, faith leaders, law enforcement. When we talk about these 200 groups that are in opposition, we are talking about folks who live and work in every community in this state of Ohio. So when they hear their respected, neighbor, the teacher of their kids, when they see that, like, the League member is also the Sunday school teacher at their church is against it, when they hear that their firefighters and policemen and first responders and nurses are against it, I think that they will understand that this is a conversation about everyday people potentially losing their power because of a power grab by a corrupt Ohio General Assembly. And I think they'll understand that. And that's our job, is to help them understand that. Also, I think we all understand the concept of majority rule. And this would not be, this would be minority rule, where 40% could, just a little over 40% could decide what policies pass or fail in Ohio. And I don't think that'll sit well with Ohioans. This is failing in other states because the people of this country believe in freedom, and they believe that we have the right to influence our own future. And here in Ohio, which, look, I'm a proud daughter of Ohio. I've never lived anywhere else. I know we are particularly and fiercely independent thinkers. And I think that we can easily appeal to Ohioans to vote no on this if we have to.
Bertram, if I can
Please
piggyback
do.
on Jen, I also think it's a pretty easy pitch to sell. I mean, people understand ball games. They understand fair competitions. They
Right.
understand go out there and win by 1 point, beat the other side by 1 point. I mean, this is the politicians telling the people that down the road in the future, you're going to have to beat us 60-40 or
Right.
better, or we win.
Right.
Excuse me, we have to beat you 60-40 or better, or you win. Well, yes, that's what they're telling us. It's a massive attempt to transfer power from the people that they've had for 111 years back to the state house politicians. And they're trying to do it at a time when in a federal courthouse down in Cincinnati, the entire nation is seeing
Yes.
the Ohio State House put on trial as being the most corrupt state house in the country. That's not my words. Those are the words of the FBI. The FBI special agent who investigated the Larry Householder case and his friends said, when it comes to state house corruption, Ohio is in a league of its own. Well, we can't allow that to happen anymore. And when all this is coming down, they're trying to pick the pocket of average Ohioans and take the power out of that pocket, and we're not going to allow it to happen.
And Jen, I know over the years, in the years that I covered politics at the Vindicator, the League of Women Voters was always made it a point to come to editorial boards in the past, to sit down with us, to talk about issues. Unfortunately, and as Mike knows, editorial boards, as the last election showed, no longer have that position of, that they used to have, where editorials in newspapers made a difference. Indeed, there is one newspaper that already came out, unfortunately, and editorialized in support of the 60% threshold. It surprised me, but be that as it may. So without a vibrant daily newspapers, pushing this issue along with you and the other organizations, what kind of media campaign would you envision mounting?
So first off, I would just say, I know you want to focus on media, and I certainly believe that local media is utterly critical in helping Ohioans understand government, who be working for them. But I want to talk about something else, which is that during the redistricting process, we were able to organize tens of thousands of Ohioans to call and ask for fair maps, to submit their own maps that were far more compact, fair. We have ourselves at the League hundreds of members who will go speak at events about redistricting. So when we lost at the ballot box in 2012, what we did was we created a speakers bureau. We understood that the people of Ohio were not quite comprehending the importance of redistricting, or why we needed to make sure that that was a fair process that resulted in fair maps. And so we had hundreds of folks, going to Rotary clubs and baking classes and, classrooms and community colleges and union halls, anywhere that folks would take us to talk about how maps are made and why they matter. And so this wouldn't, yes, if we need to defeat a ballot initiative, an attempt to make ballot initiatives harder, yes, we will do all of the press outreach, and we appreciate the press and the importance of an independent press. Yes, we would do a ton on social media, but trust and believe that the grassroots effort, the door to door, the conversations among community groups, that would also be a priority. And I think that would make a successful campaign.
And finally, Mike, two of our colleagues, Brent Larkin and Tom Suddes, both wrote columns about this and were very, very aggressive in their criticism of the Secretary of State, and pointed to what was going on here and basically said, as you had, that this is being driven by the abortion issue, the choice issue, a woman's right to choose, a woman's right to decide what to do with her own body, and the possibility of a constitutional amendment being put on the ballot. What is driving him? What's driving Frank LaRose? What's behind this?
Well, this is a national effort by some far right-wing think tanks. If you look at the websites, quite frankly, of the Heritage Foundation and the Joint Legislative Exchange Council and various policy mills that exist on the far right, Koch brothers, those folks, trying to kneecap direct democracy has been, part of their game plan for quite some time now. Just last November in Arkansas, a proposal very much like the Ohio proposal was on the ballot. They tried to get that done in the red state of Arkansas, and the people saw through it, and the people defeated it resoundingly. So I think that should be a message to our Republican leaders in the Ohio State House that people will get what they're trying to do here. But what's really driving it, it differs a little bit state by state in terms of what's current. And we mentioned, reproductive rights, anti-gerrymandering, and minimum wage here in Ohio. But what's driving it nationally is big right-wing Koch brothers style money, who, once they buy and pay for their legislators, don't want them being overridden by the people using the tools of direct democracy that many states have had for a century or more, like Ohio. And that's what we have to expose, and we will defeat them.
Wonderful. Well, listen, I do appreciate both of you coming on. This has been a very, very sort of illuminating discussion on an issue that I hope more people will pay attention to. If you go onto our website and my Facebook page and also the other platforms, you'll find that we have my co-host, unfortunately, Cynthia Urquhart, who another veteran journalist at The Vindicator, could not join me today, but we have made a determination that we want to pursue this the issue of abortion and the issue of not only reproductive rights, but this attack on women's rights and minority rights in the state and also in the country. And we're going to be pursuing this. But I would also like to continue this conversation as this unfolds on not only the constitutional amendment threshold, but also the gerrymandering. So, I would hope that if I reach out to both of you again, that you'd be willing to come and join me. We'll be posting this by midweek, and I'll send you links so that you may be able to sort of send it around and also share it, please. Well, thank you. It was a pleasure meeting you, Jen, and nice seeing you again, Mike, and we'll talk soon, I hope.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Bertram.
We've come to the end of the first podcast of the new year. I want to thank my guests, Jen Miller, Executive Director of the League of Women Voters of Ohio, and Mike Curtin, former state representative and former veteran journalist. I hope the discussion about Republican extremism will inspire Ohioans to pay close attention to what's going on in Columbus and in Washington, D.C. I'm Bertram Souza, retired editorial page editor and Sunday columnist of the now-closed Youngstown Vindicator and author of the book No Holds Barred, which is dedicated to the 150-year-old newspaper that shut its doors in 2019. My book can be purchased at Barnes & Noble in Boardman or online at scribblergroup.com. My thanks to Billy Carrier, who produced this podcast. Billy is head of Triad Production Group, a division of 21 WFMJ, and Andy Kunkel, the technical director of this podcast, who also is a member of the Triad staff. Thank you for watching, and have a pleasant day.